Now that you've seen how to navigate the units or the learning modules and the assignments that we have, let me just comment briefly on where we're going during this particular learning module. So, as is all too often the case in this class, we have a lot of ground to cover pretty quickly. So we're going to be talking about the earliest people to live in New Mexico, how they migrated to the New Mexico area, what kinds of decisions they had to make about their lifeways, the kinds of homes they built, the communities they created, what kinds of social, political, and religious structures they had, um, and what that meant for the ancestral Puebloan and the Mogollon people looking to the future. By about 1200, there were some major natural catastrophes, including drought and famine, as well as newcomers from the north called the Athapascan people, um, that all kind of came together and caused some of the first peoples to leave their homes at Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, some of the Mogollon sites in what is today southwestern New Mexico, and they migrated to new home sites along the Rio Grande, along some of the other rivers in this region, in order to have more water. But they also had to adapt their lifeways as they had to adapt to their environments. They had to adapt to the availability, or I guess I should say the lack of availability of megafauna, um, by that time, and over quite a long period of time prior to that abandonment, they had been dealing with that adaptation. So let's not confuse that one with the 1200 CE migration. But they were people who were used to adapting. They were used to um, creating new livelihoods from their environment. And they were able to create a thriving culture along the Rio Grande corridor over that period of 300 years or so prior to Spanish contact. We're going to learn about Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, who was shipwrecked off of Florida, then with three other survivors of a large expedition, wandered through not quite New Mexico, but what is today the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and met indigenous people in the region, and came to understand them on different terms than most Spanish explorers did. And so we'll think about the reasons why that was the case and why it didn't hold up. Why Cabeza de Vaca's experience didn't create a more tempered and peaceful contact between indigenous peoples and the explorers that we call the Spanish explorers. Finally, we'll wind up by looking at the patterns of conquest that the Spaniards used as they came to the Americas. Many of those got their start back in the Iberian Peninsula and then were transferred to the Americas in different places. So we'll look briefly in the e-text at the conquest of Tenochtitlan by Hernan Cortez and his group. Of course, it's not him personally or single-handedly that should have the credit there. And that's the case also for someone like Coronado, or then for Juan de Oñate, who will kind of bridge this unit and the next. As we move into Unit 3, we'll be talking about Oñate's initial colonization and the lead up to the Pueblo Revolt. And so we have to think about how the events that we're talking about during Unit 2, the earliest history of New Mexico, shaped the region and shaped the kind of contact that would take place in this area. And then, of course, as I've alluded to, Spaniards also brought their own ideas with them, which meant certain things for how the contact and the conquest would go. Finally, with this unit, something we want to think about are oral histories. As we talked about in Unit 1, history is like putting together pieces of a puzzle. It's like trying to figure out the best picture of the past available with the kinds of evidence that we have. One of those pieces of evidence is oral history evidence, or oral traditions that are passed down amongst Native peoples. And many of these people had kept their own histories in that way by passing down oral stories from generation to generation rather than having written them down. And so some questions to think about then are, what are some of the problems with oral histories? But then what are some of the problems with written histories? how do they overlap in terms of the problems we have to think about when we look at both of those types of primary sources through a critical lens, and how can we incorporate elements of both in order to tell a fuller picture about New Mexico's past. Um, so that's where we're headed this unit. I hope that you enjoy Unit 2.